Gaza's hospitals have been decimated. Most no longer function following airstrikes, repeated siege, and occupation by Israeli forces. But in those that continue to operate, a new kind of ward has appeared. This is a new ward at the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, where infants and small children undergo treatment for acute starvation. Now, the very young and the very old are usually among the first to succumb to the kind of famine conditions that Israel is imposing on the enclave. And small children, unable to express their intense hunger verbally, quickly stop eating altogether. They grow lethargic, their skin dries, and their hair becomes brittle. Next, there are seizures, coma, and finally, death. You couldn't hear it in the footage we played, but that ward filled with hungry and stressed mothers caring for their starving babies was almost completely silent. The loudest sound was the whirring of a fan. Since the beginning of July, 16 children have died from hunger, 81 have starved to death since the beginning of Israel's genocide 21 months ago. That is an alarming acceleration. But it isn't only children who are fading away. This graphic from The Guardian shows the rate at which starvation is increasing in Gaza. In the last 4 days, there have been 45 starvation deaths, and across the previous 652 days of Israel's genocide, there had been just 68 hunger-related deaths. In other parts of Gaza, starving Palestinians have almost no access to healthcare. At the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, a makeshift ward has been put together to try to treat the symptoms of severe malnutrition suffered by Palestinians of all ages. Al-Shifa is only operating at 25% capacity after being left in ruins by the IDF last year. But still, relatives and medical staff attempt to provide care and comfort for the victims of a famine that is rapidly spreading across the enclave. Now, these images that we are showing you are of Palestinians at the very end stages of starvation. But 1 in 3 Palestinians are now chronically hungry, according to the United Nations, and going multiple days without eating. Among them are the medical staff treating the starving. At Nasser Hospital, one of them told the New York Times this. The team is exhausted from hunger. Yesterday, some staff members ate just 10 spoons of plain white rice. One of the most insidious effects of starvation is that when someone has been hungry for long enough, they're no longer able to absorb nutrients when they are able to finally get food. But getting food is getting harder and harder in Gaza. These scenes were filmed at a soup kitchen in Gaza City. The UN's Philippe Lazzarini posted his own description of Gaza, saying this: "People in Gaza are neither dead nor alive. They are walking corpses. A colleague in Gaza told me this morning." Meanwhile, according to UNRWA's latest findings, 1 in every 5 children is malnourished in Gaza City as cases increase every day. When child malnutrition surges, coping mechanisms fail, access to food and care disappears, and famine silently begins to unfold. Most children our teams are seeing are emaciated, weak, and at high risk of dying if they don't get the treatment they urgently need. Earlier today, I was joined by Alex Duval. He is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's also the author of several books on famine, including Mass Starvation, The History and Future of Famine. I began by asking him why we're seeing a sudden acceleration in the rate of death by starvation in Gaza now.
One of the features of acute food insecurity and famine is that there is a sort of threshold that is reached, a place at which people who have been trying for weeks, months, or years to keep their families together, to feed themselves, to sustain themselves, to have a sense of dignity in how they are able to survive. there comes a breaking point. And when that breaking point affects a very large part of a society, there's a sort of change in state. And a functioning society becomes a starving society. Starvation isn't just that individual phenomenon of people, a person lacking nutrition, lacking food, wasting away. It's also a social phenomenon of the collective humiliation, loss of dignity, loss of everything that makes life meaningful. People who have undergone the worst famines describe how it is dehumanizing. It's like becoming an animal. And when you begin to see not just a handful of people, but a significant proportion of a community reduced to scavenging, to stealing, to having that stampede for food, that's when you recognize that this is happening. It doesn't require a statistician or a specialist to diagnose this. We can see it. And that we're at that point, it seems, in Gaza. And when that happens, it's not that the level of malnutrition and numbers of children dying just continues to increase. It increases exponentially. And the society gets sucked into a sort of vortex whereby the basic resilience that keeps a community functioning, that keeps families together, has been torn apart. And what I really fear is that we are at that point in Gaza now. Everything that I see and hear indicates that, yes, perhaps we are there, and it's the most horrible thing to witness.
Yeah, I mean, I want to ask about kind of the mechanics of what you describe. I mean, Israel had put Gaza under total siege for 2 months from March to May, and then you have a small amount of aid distributed by kind of this rogue US organization, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. But then we see, as you say, this severe deprivation, and we see what looks like an exponential increase in deaths now. I mean, how long has this been in the making? At what point did this tide start to turn for it to reach that threshold that you mentioned? Is it something that was kind of bound to happen, or is this something that is the result of decisions that were made in recent months?
So ever since this latest war began in October of 2023, the situation in Gaza has been moving between the calamitous and the catastrophic. So, what we saw repeatedly over that first year was that when the metrics, the humanitarian metrics, reached a sort of flashing red level, whereby the UN's humanitarian data system is called the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System. When they said famine might be about to happen, or when the United States' own famine early warning system also flashed red, the Biden administration would put pressure on Israel to allow more aid in. And then we had, in January to March, we had a ceasefire and we had more aid coming in. But every time the population in Gaza pushed up against those thresholds, those limits, its own capacity, its own resilience was reduced. And then we had, as you said, from March into May, a complete siege, a complete blockade, and then a new round of forced displacement and destruction. Then there was a sort of a fork in the path. So there were two options for Israel and its backers. One was to let the United Nations back in for a full spectrum of humanitarian relief, which would have done three things. It would have hopefully provided just enough calories to feed everybody. It would have provided some specialist aid for those malnourished children who are at death's door. You can't just feed a malnourished child pasta. You can't even give them baby formula. You need to give them special therapeutic food. And otherwise, they can't digest it. They also need, you need to give clean water, provide sanitation, provide cooking fuel, the essentials of life. But you also need to do this in a way that supports the basic structures of society, the families, the communities. You need to bring aid to where people are and give it through trusted mechanisms. And one of the reasons for that is if you don't do that, it will fall into the hands of armed men. We all know that in a situation of war or siege, it's the men with guns who are the last ones to starve. So that you would need close monitoring, good, effective guarding of relief convoys. None of this is perfect, but the UN has the procedures, protocols to minimize that. So turn to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so-called. What's its model? It has 4, instead of 400 sites, which is what the UN and the voluntary agencies had, it has just 4 sites, 3 of them far in the south. The rations that it provides are dry rations only, very limited. And the amount is simply not enough. It's probably maximum 1/2 of what is needed to prevent mass starvation. It doesn't provide that essential assistance that is needed for those malnourished children. It doesn't provide water, sanitation, fuel. But also the other thing that it doesn't do is it doesn't support the communities. In fact, it appears to be designed to do the opposite, to undermine them. So if you are living in Gaza and you want to get assistance, you want to get some of those rations that are available. Those ration stations are only available for a short period every day, and they only advertise the time when they will open, perhaps a few minutes beforehand. So you have to go and camp out in the rubble, in these militarized free fire zones, in order to be on hand for that Facebook announcement. Yes, such and such a ration station will open in 45 minutes and it will be open for 60 minutes. And you will rush there and you will rush down a road next to a military unit. And the soldiers there have only one way of communicating with you, which is firing their guns, using live ammunition. They don't have any means of crowd control. And so regardless of what orders they're under, maybe they are told to shoot to kill, maybe they're told try not to kill, but you use your weapons to make sure the crowd doesn't come too near the military post. People are going to get killed.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard or at least seen people saying that, aid workers saying that people in Gaza are saying, I would rather die by airstrike or have my family die by airstrike than have to watch my family die of starvation, which I think really speaks to the trauma that you're speaking about. I mean, Israel is saying, we've talked a little bit about this, that Israel, the US, say they're providing some aid and that humanitarian organizations are refusing to work with them to distribute more aid. What do you make of that? And what do you make of the ways in which Israel is kind of weaponizing this question of aid in order to kind of not sanitize their image, but basically use it as a get out of jail free card when it comes to whether or not they are conducting a genocide? They often say, if we wanted to conduct a genocide, we wouldn't be trying to provide aid. What do you make of this kind of weaponization of aid in this kind of context?
So all those who perpetrate famine try and conceal what they're doing. There are many strategies of denial that they use. And there's a very simple strategy of denial, which is you just don't allow anyone to go in and report it. And of course, they've not allowed any foreign journalists in. All the reports are from Palestinian journalists, and they are very, very harrowing. But we have become accustomed in Europe and the United States to having European and American journalists as authority figures reporting. And we haven't had that. And then there's the subtle obfuscation of trying to explain away the figures, trying to say that what you are seeing is not what you think is not how it really is. And there's statistical denialism too. There's the manipulation of statistics to say, or the suppression of statistics to say it's actually different. It's not, you're just seeing a few extreme cases. The wider phenomenon is different. And I think that the informational campaign has been very pervasive, particularly in Israel, and has fed a deep denialism. And I understand why people don't want to confront this, why they want to deny it, why they want to blame Hamas. And there are many things to blame Hamas for. Hamas is guilty of many crimes. It's guilty of all sorts of political recklessness. It is not responsible for this mass starvation that is at Israel's door. But the key point about the modalities of aid is this, which is that starvation is a weapon, but rations can also be a weapon. And the way that the rationing is being organized is weaponized. Now, yes, if Israel wanted to kill everyone in Gaza, it could do so, and it has decided not to do so. But genocide is not the killing of everybody. The threshold for genocide is different. Genocide is the destruction of a group, as such. And that can be accomplished without killing everybody. It can become accomplished while keeping people alive. And indeed, in not every concentration camp is a death camp. The British used concentration camps in South Africa and in Malaya, and they kept people alive, or most of the people alive. But it was still a crime. It doesn't prevent it from being criminal. And just because it does not have the same annihilatory intent or outcome as in the Holocaust, doesn't mean that it cannot be genocide. And my final point on this is that the Convention on Genocide is a convention to prevent genocide. We shouldn't have to wait until you can prove that it has happened to say that the obligation to stop it should be enacted. And that is important in this case because last year at the International Court of Justice, there was a provisional order, an instruction handed down to Israel by the court unanimously. Even the Israeli judge on the court voted for it. And I'll quote it for you. It is that Israel should take all necessary and effective measures to ensure without delay and full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements, as well as medical supplies and medical care, etc., etc. That is a legal order. And it's an order, it's an instruction and obligation that falls on Israel to prevent a genocidal outcome, the destruction of the Palestinians as a group. It is an obligation that falls upon other governments, including the United Kingdom government. When the British government says, we can't say if this is genocide or not because the court has not ruled. The court has ruled that there is a risk of a genocidal outcome and action has to be taken to stop that. And that is the question that Prime Minister Keir Starmer has to answer. And he's a lawyer, he knows this.
You outline there really effectively how mass starvation is used as a genocidal weapon, not just in the kind of the brute force of starvation as which literally claims lives, but in the breaking down of a society that, for a long time people in Gaza have said, the kind of the community solidarity is kind of all they've had, and this is taking aim at that. I kind of, on that thread, I mean, you write a lot about how hunger and food deprivation is not just about people barely clinging onto life. It's not just about the kind of the physical damage, but what is the damage of the psychological damage for a person or for two people, for 2 million people, sorry, when they are deprived of food for a long period of time?
So we know that the biological impacts of hunger, starvation are lifelong. We know from studies of, let's say, the Dutch hunger winter of 1944-45, that the young children who suffered malnutrition during that famine, they were shorter than their siblings. They didn't do so well in school. And they passed those deficits on to their own children. So they're the biological impacts. But the social trauma is something perhaps more profound and less easy to measure. So that the memory people have of the incidents are primarily the memories of dehumanization, of shame, the deep, deep shame, the humiliation of scavenging for food, of inflicting little acts of cruelty, turning away starving children from your door, hiding food, not participating in any, of the most basic social activities. If you have, food, if you have money to treat one child who's sick and not another, and you choose one and not the other, of selling your most precious possessions, your grandmother's jewelry, your piece of land. And it's these traumas, these humiliations, these cruelties that live on in society. So that in the case of Ireland, after the great hunger of the 1840s, there was a great silence, a silence among the Irish people about the depths of humiliation that they had suffered. And it was only in the 1990s, 150 years almost later, that the Irish were able publicly to commemorate the suffering that they had endured. And there may be other cases where it has taken less time, but it is usually a generation or more before a society can really confront the horrors of mass starvation. So I fear that the crime that is being inflicted upon the Palestinians of Gaza today, that wound will take a generation or more to heal.
Yeah, and I mean that question of the purpose of the ICJ, the purpose of the Genocide Convention is prevention. It isn't to wait until a genocide finishes and then to litigate on it. It's to prevent it. So why has it failed so spectacularly in doing so? Is that an inherent flaw in our systems of genocide prevention, or is it something else?
If governments don't want to follow their obligations under the law, then the law cannot be enforced.
An expert in the use of starvation as a weapon of genocide, as a weapon of political conflict. This is not the first time that mass starvation has been used as a weapon of colonial occupation. We know the Bengal famine, Ireland, as you mentioned. How have societies that have endured this recovered? Have they recovered? What does the next 50, 100 years look like based on what you know about the impact that this has on a society?
So the impacts can be profound and long lasting. But I want to turn that issue around, actually, because I think we talk about justice, we talk about accountability, and certainly, there can be, accountability in the courts, but there can be other forms of accountability too. There can be apologies, there can be compensation, restitution, truth-telling, giving all the assistance of all forms to acknowledge the gravity of what has happened, to allow people to confront their suffering with dignity and with a sense that the world has recognized the wrongs that have been inflicted upon them, the harms they have suffered. And I think one of the things that we need to think about now is the moral repair that will be needed to support the Palestinian people of Gaza in order for them to recover from this in the aftermath of this trauma and this crime.